Okay, let's unpack this and dive into a world that is literally all around us, but kind of hidden in plain sight.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about the microscopic drama unfolding constantly, in our food, on plants, everywhere, really.
Yeah.
These incredibly complex relationships between tiny microorganisms, especially yeasts, bacteria, fungi. They're not just sharing space, they're interacting in really dynamic, sometimes surprising ways.
That's right. Today, we're pulling insights from a really fascinating source. It's a deep dive into yeast ecological interactions, found in a handbook that's all about yeasts in food and beverages.
Okay.
So our mission is to navigate this material, pull out the most important nuggets, and try to understand this intricate web of microbial relationships that shapes so much of our world.
Yeah, and this isn't just about one microbe doing its own little thing in isolation. The source makes it really clear. This is more like a vibrant microbial melting pot. And these interactions are fundamental. I mean, fundamental to everything from how your favorite cheese tastes to, keeping fruit from spoiling.
Yeah.
So, yeah, get ready for some surprising details about what happens when these tiny neighbors meet.
So the basic idea the source lays out is pretty simple. Whenever different microorganisms find themselves in the same place, sharing a niche, right, interactions are, well, they're absolutely inevitable.
Right.
The key is figuring out the outcome, for the populations involved. Does it help? Does it harm? Or does it maybe have no effect at all?
And the handbook gives us a way to think about these interactions. It mentions direct ones like predation, one organism literally eating another,
Mhm.
or parasitism, where one lives off another.
And then there are the indirect ones, which are maybe even more common and complex. This is where you get things like competition for resources.
Basically a food fight.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Or you might see commensalism.
Where one benefits and the other's just not affected.
Yeah, right. Totally unaffected. Then there's mutualism. That's the win-win. Both organisms get something good out of it.
Okay, and then the opposite antagonism. Definitely not a win-win. One species harms or inhibits another.
And finally, you've got neutralism, where they just, coexist.
Yeah.
No real effect either way.
But here's where it gets really interesting, and this is a crucial point from the source. In the real world, especially in complex systems like fermentation or in the soil, these interactions hardly ever fall neatly into just one box.
No, it's definitely not.
You often have multiple things happening at once, overlapping, shifting around. It's this dynamic interplay that really shapes the final outcome.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If we start to unpack those interactions, one of the most striking insights from the source is that yeasts aren't just sitting there passively waiting to eat sugar.
Right.
They're actually kind of like chemical warriors. They actively produce compounds to defend their turf or inhibit rivals.
Chemical warriors. Okay, tell me more. Was this something people knew for a long time?
Well, surprisingly early, actually. The source mentions researchers way back in the very early 1900s, names like Hayduck and Fernbach, who already had a hunch that yeast were making inhibitory stuff. They noted volatile toxic extracts.
Wow, so over a century ago they were onto this. What kind of things were they finding back then?
Well, early work pointed to things like amines inhibiting bacteria. And there was even a suggestion in the 1930s that acetaldehyde, from baker's yeast, might be inhibitory. And other research showed baker's yeast could produce compounds that suppress Mycobacterium tuberculosis.
No way.
Yeah. Or even antibiotics that inhibited common molds like Aspergillus and Penicillium.
And Florey's team, the penicillin guys, right?
Yeah.
They also found that simple things like unsaturated fatty acids and succinic acid, just produced by some yeasts, could stop certain bacteria growing. So this idea of yeasts making antimicrobials, it really does have quite a history.
It does. And bringing it more up to date, the source highlights probably the most famous example of yeast antagonism, toxins.
Ah, yes, killer yeast.
Exactly. These are extracellular proteins, so they're released outside the cell, and they effectively, punch holes or mess with the cell membranes of other susceptible yeast cells.
So like tiny biological weapons targeting their own kind, almost.
Precisely. And while people initially thought maybe they were very species-specific, the source clarifies that these killer toxins are actually found across different yeast genera.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and they can even impact filamentous fungi sometimes, which, opens up fascinating possibilities for using them in industry or maybe even medicine.
Beyond those really potent toxins, the source lists other specific compounds yeasts use as weapons, right?
Like pulchrominic acid from Candida pulcherrima that inhibits fungi, or sophorosize from a yeast called T. bombicola which can fight off Staphylococcus aureus, a common bacterium, and even Candida albicans, which is a pathogenic yeast.
Wow.
And there's even a protein toxin called zygosin from Zygosaccharomyces bailii that specifically targets and kills pathogenic yeasts like Candida albicans.
So the big takeaway here, as the source emphasizes, is that, yeah, sure, competition for nutrients is happening,
Definitely.
but yeasts are clearly armed with this diverse arsenal of specific antimicrobial compounds, too. It's not just about eating faster.
Absolutely not.
It's incredible how much, active biological warfare is happening at the microscopic level. But it's not all fighting, right? You mentioned co-relationships earlier.
That's right. While antagonism is definitely key, another major insight from the source is that yeasts are also masters of collaboration. Mixed cultures where different microbes grow together are super common, both in nature and, deliberately in industry.
Okay.
And the source notes they often lead to better outcomes, maybe faster growth, more complex chemical transformations, sometimes higher yields of whatever you're trying to make.
So they team up for mutual benefit. How does that work, beyond just sharing food?
Well, it goes deeper. One species might change the environment in a way that helps another. A classic example is changing the pH. Or they might exchange essential resources, one producing something the other one needs but can't make itself. Or they might even work together to break down complex stuff that neither could really handle alone.
And the most prominent and well-studied partnership the source highlights is the one between yeasts and bacteria, especially in fermented foods.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating dance. Think about lactic acid bacteria. They're common in loads of fermentations. They produce organic acids, right? Which lowers the pH.
Okay.
Now, this low pH environment is great for inhibiting pathogens, kind of like a natural preservative.
Makes sense.
And it also creates conditions that many yeasts really thrive in.
Ah, okay. So the bacteria make it safer and more comfortable for the yeast. But what does the yeast do in return? Is it a one-way street?
Not usually, no. Yeast can actually consume those very same organic acids the bacteria produce.
Oh.
So this helps regulate the pH, stops it from getting too low, which in turn allows the bacteria to keep working. It can be this really elegant feedback loop that keeps the whole process stable.
That's a great example of mutualism. And the source gives specific examples of this give and take, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeasts providing essential growth factors.
Exactly. Things like vitamins, amino acids, the building blocks like purines that many lactic acid bacteria just can't make themselves.
Right.
And conversely, bacteria can break down complex sugars or maybe oxidize substrates that the yeast wouldn't be able to use otherwise, basically doing the prep work so the yeast can then eat.
The classic example from the source here has to be sourdough bread, right?
Absolutely. It's like a perfect little microcosm of this partnership. You've got lactic acid bacteria, like Lactobacillus San Francisco, helping break down maltose, that's a type of sugar, and making glucose available for yeast like Saccharomyces exiguus, which really needs that glucose.
Okay.
The yeast, in turn, produces CO2 for leavening, makes the bread rise.
The bubbles.
The bubbles, exactly. And it also provides growth factors that the bacteria rely on. Though, interestingly, the common baker's yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, you can use maltose. So if that yeast is present, you get a different dynamic, more like competition.
So even within that familiar sourdough partnership, there are different potential players and, slightly different ways it can play out.
Precisely. Another example the source mentions is ogi, which is a traditional African fermented cereal.
Okay.
Here you've got a whole team of bacteria and yeasts breaking down starch and acidifying the mixture. Yeasts like Saccharomyces cerevisiae and Candida mycoderma add flavor compounds, provide vitamins, and consume lactic acid, again, regulating the pH. It's complex mutualism really working together.
And these yeast bacteria tag teams aren't just for food, are they? The source mentions other applications too.
Yeah, things like using mixed cultures to improve animal waste fermentation, apparently increasing protein content and destroying pathogens.
Wow.
Or even in human health, like Saccharomyces boulardii. That's a yeast probiotic that has been shown to help prevent infections by nasty bacteria like Clostridium difficile.
Interesting. So moving beyond bacteria, yeasts also have intense relationships, you said, with other yeasts.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
You mentioned the killer toxins earlier. That's definitely yeast-on-yeast conflict.
Yeah.
Direct antagonism is common. But the source also highlights beneficial yeast interactions. For example, sometimes people combine different yeast species to more efficiently ferment multiple types of sugar,
How so?
like using Pichia staphylos together with Saccharomyces cerevisiae to work on both glucose and xylose, maybe getting higher ethanol yields from plant material.
So like a division of labor for a better overall result.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Or think about producing protein for food or animal feed, what they call single-cell protein. Using mixed cultures like Entomycopsis fibuliger to break down starch so Candida utilis can use it, can make that whole process more efficient.
Okay.
And sometimes yeasts can even share essential vitamin requirements when they're grown together. One makes what the other needs.
And the source also mentions yeast autolysis, which is basically when yeast cells die and break down. That process can release valuable nutrients, amino acids, vitamins that then support the growth of other yeasts still living in the environment. It's kind of a way the community sustains itself, even through death.
Turning now to filamentous fungi. The molds and mushrooms we might recognize more easily. The relationship between yeasts and these fungi is also complex.
Right. Is it mostly conflict there? Because you hear about yeast being used as biocontrol against fungi.
That's definitely a major part, and we'll get into that more. But the source also knows mutualism can happen here too.
Really? How?
Well, just like with bacteria, some fungi can provide yeasts with enzymes to break down really complex plant materials like cellulose that yeasts just can't handle on their own.
Ah.
So fungi do the heavy lifting, the yeast gets the usable sugar, and maybe you get better yields if you're trying to turn agricultural waste into something useful.
And here's a slightly counterintuitive detail from the source. Sometimes the substances released by yeasts can actually stimulate fungal growth, like Rhodotorula mucilaginosa apparently enhancing the growth of certain beneficial fungi that live with plant roots. So yeah, it's not a simple yeast versus fungus story all the time.
What's fascinating here is how all these different types of microbial interactions, the fights, the friendships, the exchanges, they all come together to shape the flavor, the texture, the safety even of the foods and drinks we consume every single day. The source really emphasizes that it's the combined activity of these microbial communities that determines the final quality of so many products.
Yeah, and as the source confirms, that yeast-bacteria dance is probably the most central one to the food we eat. Let's maybe look at a few specific examples from the handbook where these interactions are really key players.
Sure. Well, we've already touched on sourdough and ogi as great examples of beneficial mutualism and pH regulation in starch-based foods.
Right.
The source also talks about sequential fermentations, like in soy sauce and miso. Here, you often have fungi starting things off, breaking down complex starches and proteins. And then yeasts and bacteria come in, interacting to create that really deep, complex flavor profile, regulate the pH, and produce some alcohol.
So it's like a microbial relay race, different players taking over at different stages.
Exactly. And in dairy, you see it in products like kefir or maybe acidophilus yeast milk. Here, yeasts and bacteria work together, often in ways that are commensal. One benefits, the other's neutral or mutualistic.
Improving the product somehow.
Yeah, improving quality, stability, even safety by inhibiting pathogens sometimes. Cheese maturation is incredibly complex. Yeasts can contribute to texture and flavor changes. They might support the ripening bacteria, but they can also compete or even cause spoilage if the wrong ones get in.
What about meat? You mentioned data was limited, but are there interactions there?
Yeah, the source notes yeasts can play a role in fermented sausages, maybe adding flavor or helping stabilize the color, but they can also interact negatively. For instance, if they break down preservatives, that might accidentally allow spoilage bacteria to grow better. So it really depends on the specific microbes and the conditions.
Right, it's complicated. And vegetables, like olives. I feel like I've heard yeasts are involved there somehow.
They definitely are, and it's a perfect example of their kind of dual nature. Yeasts can be detrimental, causing spoilage by growing too much or changing the pH in a bad way.
Okay.
But they can also be highly beneficial. They might consume bitter compounds from the olive, making it taste better. They can help beneficial lactic acid bacteria grow, add desirable flavors themselves, or even use their killer toxins against other spoilage yeasts.
A real double-edged sword, then. Now, moving to alcoholic drinks. The source seems to detail a really rich tapestry of interactions here. Wine, for instance, sounds incredibly complex.
It is. You've got straightforward competition for sugars, obviously.
Yeah.
You've got killer yeasts potentially impacting the main fermentation yeast. And then you have these fascinating interactions with the lactic acid bacteria that are needed for malolactic fermentation.
Right. That's the process that softens the acidity.
Exactly. Converts the sharp malic acid into softer lactic acid. It's crucial for the style of many wines.
And the source explains how the main yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and its activity can either help those bacteria along,
Maybe by releasing nutrients when the yeast cells break down later, that autolysis thing.
or it can inhibit them.
Right. Due to the low pH, the alcohol level, or maybe specific fatty acids the yeast produces. It's a delicate balance.
Okay. What about beer? Is it simpler there?
Well, the goal in beer is usually for the inoculated brewer's yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae again, to completely dominate.
Right.
It usually inhibits spoiling organisms pretty well through high alcohol, low pH CO2 production, stuff like that. But wild yeast can still be a real problem if they manage to get in and conditions allow them to grow.
And even killer strains of the good yeast can cause problems.
Yeah, if the main culture strain you're trying to use happens to be sensitive to the killer toxin produced by another Saccharomyces strain that snuck in, it can really mess up the fermentation.
Wow. And quickly, for distilled beverages like whiskey or rum.
The source mentions interactions there too, mainly between the primary yeast and various indigenous bacteria. These interactions can influence the final yield and the flavor profile. The yeast might even excrete things that help certain beneficial bacteria thrive, even while other bacteria might be competing with the yeast for nutrients.
So shifting gears quite a bit now, the final key application from the source that really demonstrates the power of these yeast interactions is their role in protecting plants.
Yeasts as guardians of our produce. How does that work? It's a growing field, often called biocontrol, and it's driven, partly at least, by looking for alternatives to chemical fungicides, due to environmental and health concerns.
Makes sense.
The source provides pretty compelling evidence that certain yeasts can effectively protect post-harvest fruits and also stored grains from fungal spoilage.
And some of these are actually being used commercially now.
Yes, the source points to a couple of examples like Candida oleophila, which is sold under the brand name Aspire, and Pseudozyma flocculosa, marketed as Sporodex. They're used to prevent fungal rot on harvested fruit.
That's amazing. How do they actually do it? What are the mechanisms behind this protection?
Well, the source outlines several proposed ways they work. They can produce antifungal metabolites, maybe like certain fatty acid derivatives we mentioned earlier, but critically, competition for nutrients.
Ah, the food fight again?
Exactly. Competition for nutrients right there at the site of potential infection, like a wound on a piece of fruit, is highlighted as possibly a principal mode of antagonism. The yeast basically outcompetes the spoilage fungus for food before it can even get established.
So a microbial land grab, but with a beneficial outcome for us.
Precisely. Other possible mechanisms include the yeast maybe triggering the plant's own defense responses,
Interesting.
or producing enzymes that actually break down the fungal cell wall, or using those killer toxins we talked about, or even just physically attaching to the fungal cells and stopping them from growing properly.
So multiple strategies.
Yeah, and scientists are continually discovering and isolating new natural yeast antagonists from all sorts of different environments.
Wow. Okay, so we've really journeyed through this hidden, intricate world of yeast interactions today. We've seen them engage in microscopic chemical warfare, form these crucial partnerships in the foods we eat every day, and even act as these tiny guardians protecting our plants.
It really drives home the point that these aren't just simple, isolated organisms doing their own thing. They exist within these dynamic communities, constantly influencing and being influenced by their neighbors and their environment.
Yeah.
The source gives us a huge amount of detail and insight, but it also, quite honestly, highlights how much still remains kind of vague or inadequately studied, particularly the exact mechanisms happening in many of the familiar fermented foods we enjoy. There's still a lot to learn.
So what does this all mean for you listening? Well, the next time you slice into a piece of tangy sourdough bread or pour a glass of wine or even, spot a bit of unwanted mold on some fruit, maybe take a moment to consider the unseen complex drama of microbial interactions happening right there. It's a tiny ecosystem shaping our world in these profound, often delicious, and sometimes protective ways, and it makes you wonder what other microbial collaborations are out there, perhaps right under our noses, just waiting to be discovered and understood.